the cloud. Okay, we are recording. Office hours, July 11th, 2017. Let's get started. So Zubair had a bunch of questions about testing. And do you want to just kind of talk about what your questions are? We can have a discussion about it. I know you've got a couple of specific things listed in here, but I'd like to kind of hear it in your own words, what you're curious about.
Yeah, that sounds good. I guess I can talk from the first point. How do we test any kind of routing with Node.js? Like, suppose say we are setting up an Express server and we have a route that handles a GET request to just slash a route that handles a POST request to slash and do something. How do we write tests for these?
That is a really good question. So there's a couple ways that you can do this. So one answer, and probably the easier answer, is to cover your routes in integration tests. So you could actually use something like Node's built-in HTTP GET to like issue an HTTP request to your own server in your tests. So you could like, in your test, like start up the server and then issue the GET request and just like hit the server from the front end. And that'll test your routes and it'll test everything down all the way to your database, right? All the way to your back end. So you can set up some like basic integration tests to like test routing and like general overall functionality. It also tests that all the pieces are kind of wired together the right way. And that's one way to do it. Those tests are going to tend to be slow because you got to start up a server and you got to do that like HTTP request. You wouldn't test your whole application that way. You wouldn't test like every edge case in your application that way, but you could test all your routes that way. And then all of the specific behavior of individual controllers and actions and that sort of thing you can test in unit tests. Let's see. There are, So I'm trying to see if there are like some good libraries for doing this with Express. Fortunately, I have more experience doing this in other languages than in JavaScript. I wouldn't be surprised if there are some good modules out there for like unit testing your routes. I'm seeing a lot of stuff here about a library called Supertest, which, let me share my screen and show you this. Share my browser. So the first several things I'm coming up with on Google for like unit testing or like testing routes are this Supertest, which looks like it gives you a nice DSL, a nice like domain specific language for testing like requests to a certain app where you can just sort of pass in your app and then hit like a route specifically and then like create some expectation about the response that you get back. So something like this looks really nice, and I'm seeing enough of it on the internet that I would imagine that's probably pretty widely used. So I would look into this Supertest thing. And I may dig into that myself after this, and if it's useful, maybe we can end up doing like a lecture, or I can put together something on it. But that would be a good starting place, I would say. Does that help at all?
Yeah, that's.
I don't have more experience with a specific library in JavaScript, but that's kind of the way that I would expect to do it in other languages, and this looks like it's a pretty well-trodden way to do it in Node. If I can just get back to the Zoom, why do you hide all the controls whenever I share my screen? All right, anyway, there we go. So testing routing express and on client side. And your next one is about testing SQL databases with or without the use of a test environment variable. Can you talk about that a little more?
What are the best practices? Like I know I'm doing the to-do SQL benchmark, and it talks about setting up a test SQL database where you run all your tests. I don't know what industry practices. That would be nice to know. Is it like common practice in a web developer job, if you're doing the back end, to create a test database for the little chunk of the application you're working on? Is any way like professionals with test databases would be
Yeah.
great information.
Yeah. So what I'd say is probably industry standard, I guess, or common practice is to have a separate database that you use in your tests. And this isn't like a database with a bunch of data in it that you can use to like poke around in your application. Normally what you would do is create a test database, and in your application, whenever you're connecting to Postgres, for example, and you're specifying what the name of the database is, instead of having that hard coded in, you can use use an environment variable. So with Node, it's usually node_env, right? And kind of check that environment variable and pull in a different config depending on which environment you're in. So you could have a different database configured for your test environment than for your like development environment, for instance. So when your tests are running, I believe Mocha by default and other testing libraries will automatically set node env to test when they're running, but you could also just easily add that in your like package.json script. But like key off of that environment variable to use a test database in your tests. And then before each individual test runs, you basically delete all of the data out of the database so that the test starts with an empty database. And then each test is sort of responsible for like, okay, I'm going to create this fake user, and then I'm going to try and do something to it, and I'm going to test the result. And then when the test is over, it just wipes out the database again. So the next test starts with a pristine environment. And that's really common. And you'll see there are libraries like Factory Girl, which you can use to like create test data that will like automatically create rows and different tables in your database using like default values that you configure to make it really easy to sort of set up a bunch of test data in order to run a test that'll then just get blown away at the end of that test for the next test to run. But that's really common. And it's a really good practice to have your tests running in that kind of an isolated environment where they don't depend on something already being set up in the database before the test run starts, or something that might have been created in a previous test. You want each of your tests to be run in a real isolated environment where they set up their own scaffolding, they set up their own test data. So you're sort of working with like a known state of the system when you run your test so that it's like repeatable and your tests will run the same every time. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
And then does that kind of cover what you were getting at in industry best practices for testing as a web developer, or there's other things you wanted to dig into there?
No, I would say so. And it also kind of handles the next question too. They're like a dot cat, these two questions.
Okay, awesome. And then Helen was asking in the chat about how would you test an endpoint without a library? And that if you wanted to just kind of roll your own by hand, you could start your server in your tests. You could start up your server, and then you could use HTTP. You just the HTTP library that is built in with Node. So it's a library, but it's a built-in library with Node, where you're just like kind of interacting directly with the HTTP protocol, right? And you can issue GET requests to your own application in your tests in order to test the routes. Does that kind of answer your question? Helen? You still here? I'm going to assume silence means yes. Okay.
Oh, are you talking to me? Sorry.
No. I was talking to Helen. Asked
yeah,
a question in. Give an example of that. Yeah, sure. So let's see if we can play with that a little bit. Let me share a different part of my screen, assuming Zoom will let me. There it is, stop share. Okay, so let me share my terminal so y'all can see that. Okay, so just going to do this all in one file for right now. So, okay, so we're going to create this server.js file, and we're going to see express equals require. So let's create a little express app here. So this out of the way. Actually, this will be faster if I use something I already have. Let me just go to something I've already built. This was in where am I? Ah, there we go. Okay, so here's a simple server.js gap that from the lecture from Monday that just has a couple of routes and response with basic strings. I'm going to just delete some of this to simplify. Okay, so we've got this this really simple app here, and if we go over here and start it, it's broken. Bad option inspect. Of course, things have been broken. Sorry, I was playing with this earlier today and broke things. Super close. Move the cookie parser. Okay, so now we got a simple app. There's a root route, hello world. There's a foo route. We'll just have it return the route. So now we should have a working application. Come on, it can't be that hard. And handled error event use. Oh, I'm already running a server on that port. There we go. Okay, so, and once again, I'm just going to share my whole screen because that will be simpler. Just close the stuff we don't need. And all right, so we've got this application running, localhost 300, 3000. Okay, so that's peachy. So the question is like, how do we test these things? And so let us, let me just install Mocha and Chai. You should be somewhat used for that, used to that. And open this back up, and then I'm going to create some tests here, right? We're gonna require that's wrong. Express. No. Expect from chai. And let's make a little describe block, describe my app, and subtest. Okay, so we want to somehow test routes here. And let's just make sure that right. Package.json, let's add testing here. And we just need to add that. Oh, I always forget. I need to add the ES6 stuff here real quick for Mocha. And I always have to look it up. No, that's not what I want. Docs. Setup. There we go. Setup for Mocha. There it is, compilers. That's the one. Okay, so got some Mocha tests set up here, npm test. Yay, okay, so our tests are running. Fantastic. So what we want to do here is actually run the server itself and test it, right? So one of the things we could do is we could actually in the tests, we could say before each, all right, so there's a couple ways we can do this. One way to do this is just require server.js in the tests, right? So we pull in this test file, which is going to read in this Express app and start listening on port 3000. And then grab the HTTP library from HTTP. So this is the built-in HTTP library in Node, and execute some request, right? HTTP.get. And let's go remind ourselves of the syntax for that. Roll. HTTP get. Now it's in here somewhere. There it is. So URL and get the response. So that's probably all we need. So we can just say something like this, and we're just going to hit localhost port 3000, and we'll get the root, right? And we should be able to assert that the status code, so we can say expect result dot status code to equal 200, which would be a successful request. And then we just need to call the done callback from Mocha. Tell it we're done. So it serves the home page without error is kind of what we're testing there. That's probably. So we're just calling get and getting our own app, which we've just started up here at the beginning of these tests. Let's see if that works. This is kind of a crude way to do this, but if you really wanted to do it by hand without a library, this is kind of how you'd start. You cannot find module server.js because we need a relative path. And the tests, chai default is not a function, and the address isn't used. So one thing I want to do is kill our development server because we're using the same port. And then expect is just one of the things that SHA exports. There we go. So there's our test, right? Serves the home page. And if we could add some logging in here, right, to show that we're getting back, well, so for instance, let's say that we expected this to 404. We should be able to see that that test will fail. Yeah, all right, so we're getting a 200 back instead of a 404. So that's a real sort of low-level brute force way to do it, is just like source in your own app to start it up, and then use HTTP GET and POST and the different methods from the HTTP built-in module. Like hit your own app, and you can check status codes. You can check the body of the response, right? So you got to do this. This little song and dance, which you should be familiar with from some of the other modules if you've gotten that far. But we can like read in the data, and we can say on end, let's call this body. Right. So then we could make some expectation about the, expect body to match the world. And then we want to put done in there because that's going to happen last. Exec is not a function. This needs to be a regular expression. Let's see. Is that going to work? It works. So then failing tests. It's always good. Never trust your tests when they pass. You always want to prove to yourself that your tests will fail if the wrong thing happens, because it's actually surprisingly easy to write tests that pass for the wrong reasons. And so you'll never know they're not actually testing what you expect. So this is always nice to see that, it's actually comparing what you think it's comparing. So does that answer your question a little bit more thoroughly? And again, like this is kind of a brute force way to do it. I would imagine there are other NPM modules out there that will sort of give you a little bit of a cleaner way to do this, that will sort of abstract some of this messiness for you of like sourcing in your own server. And there are issues with doing it this way, which we already saw, right? Which is, in my server.js, I have this hard-coded port, which isn't a great idea in tests, right? Because you might already have your development server running on that port. So you would want some way to either, change which port you're using based on the environment. So in development, you use port 3000. For testing, you might use a random port or just some other like 3001 or some other unused port. So you need to add in a little bit more logic to make this a more robust solution. And by the time you do that, you might start looking at some NPM modules that maybe do some of that stuff for you. But this is sort of the basic idea. Is that helpful? Coming back to the chat. Is done sort of a built-in method in Chai that can be used to end a test? Yes. So it's actually from Mocha. So in Mocha, you have these, this it idiom, right? Where you can say it and give some name for a test, and then a callback function that sort of defines the test. And the first argument to that callback function, the callback function you're going to pass to it, the first argument is going to be a done callback. Which you can then call when your tests are done. Because of like asynchronous things going on, Mocha can call this function, but it's never really going to know like have the tests finished yet, or is there still some asynchronous piece of code that's waiting to be run when a server gets back to it or whatever? So yeah, done is just the first argument to this function that you pass to it, to the function it, the mocha function it. And then you just, you want to call done whenever your sort of last callback is finished. That'll clue mocha in that your tests are finished. Just for giggles, if we comment that out, I think, well, if we comment that out and actually change the test to not fail, I think we'll get a timeout here, if I'm not mistaken. Right, so see the test just sort of runs and then you get this timeout because it was just waiting forever and it doesn't know when the tests are done if you don't call done explicitly, so it just waits for a default timeout of 2000 milliseconds and then just bails. And you'll get this nice message about for asynchronous tests and hooks, ensure done is called. The other thing you can do with these it functions is if this function returns a promise, then you don't have to call done, and Mocha's smart enough to like wait for the promise to resolve. So once you get into promises, you can do it that way. Let's see, there was another question. Why does hello world need to be a regular expression? And that is just, that's just because I'm using this to match matcher from the chai library, and match just expects a regular expression. It's just the way that function works. I could say expect body to equal and then pass a string. And that would work just as well. The matching is nice when you're testing the results of a web page because you're rarely going to want to like test that every character in the web page is identical. You might just be testing for like, I expect that this web page has a certain error message on it or has a certain header. So I guess muscle memory, I typed match instead of equal. Other questions about this in the chat? Could you explain the relationship between mocha and chai? Thomas asks. That's a really good question. Yeah, when you start into a new programming language, it can be hard to sort of piece apart the different libraries and things. So to illustrate this, I'm just going to comment out chai. So if we don't use chai at all, we just get what mocha gives us. And what mocha gives us is these describe and it blocks, right? So let's get real basic here and take out this server stuff. In fact, we're just going to comment all that out and start over. So you can see a kind of a clean example here. So with just mocha, we get these things called, if I can spell it right, describe and it. And mocha also gives us before each. So mocha is just giving us a way to kind of an easily readable way to declare tests and then to define common code that needs to run before each test. So this is the first test. So let's look and see what this looks like. I'm actually going to bring up, if I can type the right character. All right, I'm going to bring up a console here on the right side so we can see this. We are still in this directory. npm test. And you can see, oh, I'm not calling done. Silly me. before each hook. Oh, I guess I have to do it up here too. Oh, it figures. Write code in front of people and things break. Before each hook in test one, timeout. Oh, I'm not calling it. I'm just naming it. There we go, finally. Okay, so when I run npm test, you can see that I'm actually just invoking this mocha command. And I'm adding the Babel compilers, right? But since I'm not actually using any of that stuff, I could even simplify this to just say mocha test.js from node modules where it's installed. So mocha is sort of this like app, right, that takes some JavaScript code and runs it. And because you're invoking the JavaScript code with mocha, it sort of gives you some stuff for free. And what it's giving you for free is describe, before each, it, and a couple other things. And then what it does is it allows you to sort of declaratively say, this is my tests, and this is a block of code I want to run before each test is run. We can have an overall describe, like my tests. And then Mocha is doing this thing where it'll run your tests for you in sort of some reasonable order, and it gives you this nice output, right, with like green check marks when tests pass, and it makes sure that before each block gets run before every test. So you see I've declared this before each block once, but it actually gets run before the first test and before the second test. And so Mocha is giving you that sort of scaffolding so that it gives you sort of a nice language for declaring tests, then it handles sort of running them for you. And the way Mocha works is it assumes that if your test doesn't throw an error, then the test passes, which is why these tests have this green check mark, like the test passed, even though I didn't test anything. And so what I could do is say, so in these tests, if I want a failing test, all I do is throw an error. Test failed. So if I do that, we'll see that test one failed, and it doesn't kill the application, right? It catches that error, it runs the rest of my tests, but it marks that test one has failed, and it gives me this nice output at the end saying, well, it tells me that I should have thrown an error instead of a string, which is good advice. New error. It's the proper way to throw an error, right? So that I get this nice output here, and it tells me what about the test failed by just printing out the error message. So with Mocha, you get this nice like testing framework. And then if you actually want to, when you're writing your tests, you kind of have to do some of this stuff by hand, right? Where you could have some method, right? And you could say, okay, I've got some addition method, and I expect that, sorry, result equals add 2 plus 2, right? So if I had some addition method that was supposed to add two numbers together, and then I could say if result is not equal to 4, and I could throw some error saying, 2 plus 2 is not, and then result, whatever that is, right? Let's do it this way. So I could write the test that way. And now if I run it, add is not defined. We got to write that function. Let's write that real quick. So we'll create an add function that takes 2 arguments and returns a plus b. So there's a correct implementation of an add function. So I run it that way, my tests pass. If I come in here and I break the add function by saying, I'm going to add the 2 numbers and then add 2, then this result won't be 4. My if block, this test will pass, and then it'll end up throwing that error. And assuming that I can write JavaScript correctly, that should be a $. I'll get this nice error message. 2 plus 2 is not 6. So this gives me really nice output in my tests. But this type of code here is just a little bit verbose, right? I gotta, if not equal to, throw new error. And what Chai gives you is several different syntaxes to choose from that basically provides a lot of this boilerplate code for you so that you can make these kinds of assertions, right? That like the result should be a certain number and give you these nice formatted error messages without you having to write it all by hand. So if we come back in here and we grab Chai, one of the ways Chai gives you to write those types of assertions is this expect method, right? So I'm going to grab this expect thing from Chai, and that's going to let me rewrite this test a different way, where instead of this big if block, I can just say expect result to equal 4, right? Which is a lot like simpler way to do that. And what this is doing under the hood is it's doing this test and it's throwing an error if result is not equal to 4. This is just like a more human readable and
Trevor?
Yeah,
Your screen's been frozen for a while.
No. Sorry about that. Is it still frozen?
Yeah.
All right, let's see. Thanks for saying something. Hang on, let's see if I can start this share again. How about now? Can you see it now?
It's blank.
Blank?
Yeah, it's like black and it just says Trevor Little has started screen sharing.
That's interesting. I do not know why Zoom is doing that, but it's not super helpful. Let's try this another way. How about that? Can you see that?
Still the same screen as before. It's still black.
Okay, I'm gonna try one thing real quick and
It works.
It works. You good?
I'm good. I don't know about everyone else.
Okay, can everybody see that? Can I get like a +1 in the chat if you can see? Yes, great, okay. Sorry about that. All right, so I'm not sure what the last thing you saw was. But so what I was showing is, let's clean this up. So this is the like by hand way to write tests, right? Where you're just going to call your method, you're going to get the result, and then you're going to use if statements or some other control flow to check and see if the result is what you expect. And if it's not, you throw an error and you write your own error message, right? And test. So doing that, right, that works. And what Chai gives you is, allows you to import a couple of different, so there's like three or four different syntaxes that Chai supports, but the one that I like to use most is expect. And to use expect, you just import expect from Chai and allows you to do things like this. You say expect result to equal 4, and that's going to do the like throwing an error message with the reasonable string for you. And so now I get this nice assertion error, expected 6 to equal 4. And I didn't have to write that error message. It happened for me. And Chai is even going to give me this like diff output that shows me like you were expecting that, you're expecting this, but you got this. So it just it means I'm writing less code to get like nice error messages. And it gives you, I could say I expect this to be less than 4. And it gives you a lot of these assertions that'll do all kinds of different tests for you and then give you nice readable error message. Expected 6 to be below 4. So that's what Chai is. Chai is just, it's called an assertion library, and it's just built-in helper functions basically for, asserting some fact that like result is less than 4 or something like that, and then throwing a helpful error message if it's not. Does that clear up the question? Awesome. Awesome. Did I miss any other questions in the chat? Where were we? We were at mocha and chai. Could you add multiple expects in an it and use done to end them, or is it bad practice to add multiple expects in one it? That's a really good question. I would say that you want your its to be pretty focused on like testing a specific thing, so that if that test fails, you know where to go look for the bug, right? So it's not bad practice to add multiple expects to one it, and a lot of times that might be what you want to do. So for instance, I might say, expect the result to equal 4. I might also, say something like expect type of result to equal number. Let's see if that works. If I fix add, it should work. Right, so I've got two expects in here, and they're both sort of testing that like this thing should be a number and it should be 4. So that's reasonable, right? What you wouldn't want to do is in the same it block start testing a completely different method, right? And say, let's test a subtraction method and let's make sure that 4 minus 2 is equal to 2. You don't want to start doing this because then it's going to get really confusing for you when your tests are running and failing, why exactly they're failing, right? Because you'll just get an error message and say, oh, I expected 4 to equal 2. But it's not clear at that point, well, is that when the addition failed or when the subtraction failed, or what is it that failed? And so you want your test to be pretty focused, but there are times where you're really testing sort of one feature or one edge of your code, but there are a couple of expectations that you might want to group together in that test. Does that make sense? So like this here, lines 12 and 13 together is probably reasonable, but like you don't want to start testing like a bunch of unrelated stuff in the same it. And someone was asking about done, but yeah, you can have multiple expects and then just call done at the very end. Awesome. Is there advantage to using mocha/chai over a single library like Jasmine Node? There is, that's not, I wouldn't make a blanket statement that like, oh yeah, mocha chai is better than Jasmine Node. There's a lot of different testing libraries and frameworks out there. Some of it's going to come down to personal preference. They probably each have strengths and weaknesses. I think mocha is just written in a way that like mocha doesn't include an assertion library for you, so that you can kind of use whatever you want. Kind of gives you that flexibility because some people have preferences for certain kind of assertions over others, certain syntaxes over others. I like mocha chai honestly because I spent a lot of time writing Ruby, and mocha is basically a port of the RSpec testing framework from Ruby. And so I'm familiar with the syntax, and I like the way that it's structured. But there's no like one true way to do it. There's lots of different options out there. So feel free to play around with other stuff. But mocha and chai I think is pretty popular. And the advantage of using a popular library is you're going to find more help on the internet when you get stuck with it, and you're more likely to that's more likely to be the thing that's going to be used at a job you might get. So it's, but I have used, I've used Jasmine for front-end tests before, for like browser-based JavaScript tests. I haven't used Jasmine Node, but I've used Jasmine in the browser, and I liked it. And I skipped a question here. Diagnostics of failed regular expression matches just say false rather than true. Any way to enrich them? Jonathan, can you expound on that a little bit? I'm not sure I follow.
Well, if you do a test of a match, that returns either true or false. And so mocha chai tells you if it fails that it was false instead of true or true instead of false. But but that's not helping you very much figure out why the match didn't work.
Mm-hmm.
So since you had just said that the diagnostics are helpful, I thought, hey, this is an exception to that,
Gotcha.
where diagnostics don't tell you much, and I'm wondering if there are tricks to get to diagnose those regex matching failure.
Gotcha. So, so if you, by default, if you say expect hot dogs are yucky to match hot dogs are yummy, right? If you use this to matcher, you do get this somewhat helpful error message that shows you what what the string actually was and what the regular expression you intended it to match was. So you get a little bit of diagnostics there. You don't just get like the match failed. You will actually print out the string so you can kind of look at it and ascertain why it failed. I'm trying to think beyond that. But are you saying like, you're looking for some sort of more robust message than that that'll actually show you like which part of the string didn't match?
Yeah, that would be cool. I've never heard of that, but I mean, regex, analysis obviously keeps on succeeding until some point when something breaks it, makes it fail, and ideally you would want to know, hey, at what point did the regular expression parser say,
right, yeah. Mocha doesn't. Chai doesn't give you anything more robust than this, to my knowledge. That would be cool. I will say one of the things that expect gives you, it's not for regular expressions. So if you're just like, testing a string match like this, this is kind of the best error message you're going to get. Yeah. Unfortunately, it's a good question. It'd be cool if it gave you something a little bit more, like a diff output, right? Where you can see the, like which part of the string didn't match. That would be nice. Maybe there are other assertion libraries out there that do that. Let's see. Did I miss anybody's questions in the chat before I switch back over to the agenda? I think I caught everything. If I missed your question, I'm terribly sorry. And just like cut and paste it back into the chat and I'll get to it. I'm going to flip back over to the agenda and see what else we didn't get to yet. So what exactly is an API? What makes up of an API? That's another good question. So API stands for Automated Programming Interface, probably. I'm going to Google that because it's been a while. API stands for, I'm pretty sure it's Automated Application Program Interface. That's close, super close. So an API is just a general word to describe an interface for a program. If the program you're talking about is a web server, which is probably where you're going to hear this term used most at Learner's Guild, an API is sort of the defined interface for interacting with that program. And the idea is that, programs have interfaces, they have human interfaces, right? So your web app is probably going to have a human interface, which is, your HTML page and buttons people can click on. But an API generally refers to an interface to your application that is intended to be used by other programs, which is like an application programming interface. And so in a web application context, an API might be a collection of routes, and it's just something you define where, okay, if you send a GET request to this route with these parameters, then you can expect this kind of response. So I don't know if you've gotten to the REST API module yet, but REST is sort of a series of conventions for building APIs. So that, it's for building sort of similar APIs that use a lot of the same rules and idioms. But really any way that an application can be interacted with by another application could be defined as an API. And you'll find the concept of an API helpful. A lot of times you can even think of modules as having an API. So this sort of whole like expect thing here, where I can say expect.to.match is kind of an API for expect, right? You can think of functions as having an API, right? So this add function has an API that basically says, okay, you can interact with this function by passing in 2 variables that are integers, and you can expect an integer to be returned. That's the sum of those 2 variables. That's sort of the API of the add function. And so APIs for an application are just sort of like a kind of a zoomed out version of that. Like, okay, you can send this sort of input to this application and expect these sorts of outputs from the application. And it's an API because it's sort of defined in a way that is rigorous enough that other applications could then like depend on that behavior and write code against it. Helen's asking, would a route/endpoint be considered an API? Yeah, it certainly could. Usually an API for a web application is going to be probably a series of routes/endpoints that sort of work together to provide a way to interact with the application from the outside. From a separate application. So in the case of like your full stack app, right, a lot of times your server code, right, has an API that you're accessing from code in the browser on the front end, right? So your the sort of the application that's interacting with your server-side application is just the code that you've written in the browser, your sort of front-end JavaScript that's making calls back to the server. Does that answer that question? Not sure who asked it. Someone says yes. Okay, great, great. The only thing left on the agenda is testing with mocha and chai. We talked a bit about that already, but I don't know if we covered what was desired to be covered by whoever added that to the agenda. Are there other things y'all want to see about testing with mocha and chai? Or any other questions you'd like to talk about? Okay, I'm gonna take that as a no. All right, we've got about 5 minutes left in case you have any other questions. I will just leave this Zoom thing open while I start poking around with other stuff. But if that's it, thanks y'all for showing up and happy learning the rest of your Tuesday. And I'll see you on the internet.